Welcome to Lecture 3 of Philosophy for Living. Today's lecture is going to focus on the birth of the self. This follows on from our conversation about awareness and looking at the influences that come to bear to make us who we are. And also looking at the tools that you may need to actually begin to track down and get to a deeper understanding of who you are. So we're going to move a little bit more into the deeper, more detailed aspects of what that means in terms of what it means to be a person. I'm going to start off with a quotation from Viktor Frankl. And as you may know, Viktor Frankl is a psychiatrist who was a survivor of the Holocaust, lost his family in Auschwitz. And through that experience, he developed an understanding of an aspect of the human condition, which is the search for meaning. And in that project, he began to understand the human being as this individual, unique human being that had a life project. And he says each human being is unique in both his essence and his existence, and is thus neither expendable nor replaceable. Now there's two pieces in this quotation that are worth looking at. He says about the person's essence and their existence. He's making that distinction. So your unique selfhood comprises your essence and your existence. Now, the philosophy of existentialism, which was very popular in the 70s and 80s, and which was built a lot on the work of Martin Heidegger, who we've already talked about, but became very popularized in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, had a slightly different view, because Sartre's idea was, and he's written this in his book Existentialism and Humanism, which is that there is no essence before existence. So the existentialists and the Sartrean existentialists would have said that essentially we're creating our own reality. We create our own personhood. We create who we are is a self-creation. This is a fairly extreme view, and has, of course, died out. It was very fashionable at the time, and then was replaced by postmodernism, which is a very different take on how people become people in the world. So I will be actually arguing in this lecture, or presenting this, that actually essence and existence are both important concepts in terms of understanding who you are in the world. We go back to Heidegger again, and we talk about the idea that along the path of life, you've got your past, and that past has been created largely by certain attributes that you've had with decisions you've made and circumstances you find yourself in. But you're always at that kind of nodal point when you're in a position to create your future. And at the end of our last session, we said, well, how do you know what future to create? So this takes us into the issue of what is your life task and who are you as a human being. One of the things that you've probably noticed is that I focus a lot about history here, because I think it's important when we take stock of our lives to take a look and see who we are in this moment in time, in the time that you find yourself. And the reason why I do that is because it's very important to develop a sense of a bigger picture of yourself as a member of the human race, of the human family, if we can call it. And as such, I would say that one of the things that in the West that is missing is a sense of gratitude for the extraordinarily privileged position that we find ourselves in the world today. We are very privileged and very fortunate, because as you travel through your mind's eye into history, you realize that actually what we have available to us today is an extraordinary levels of health, of well-being, of adventure, of all of these things. And why is that? Because it took hundreds of thousands of years of the development of civilization to bring us to where we are in the Western world. There are forces afield which are actually attempting to dismantle a lot of what has actually been gained over the centuries. I won't go into that for too much, but except to acknowledge it. So civilization is the process by which we as human beings developed and cultivated and built culture over a period of centuries. And one of the things that came from that was the development of the idea of the individual as being important. And this is because this is relatively new. So the challenges that we're taking today or being given today is a deeper understanding of what that means. But for centuries and for millennia, that actually really wasn't that important. The individual was not very important. I like to use the metaphor of the leaf on a tree. The leaf actually had no real significance. It played its part, but its identity was not the important thing. The cultivation of the leaf was not the important piece. The growth of the tree was the important piece. And of course, it needs its leaves, of course, but the leaf is not the significant piece. This has changed over the centuries. And now we find ourselves today, in our lives today, with a focus on the individual. And that's relatively new. I want to quote, and in doing that, as time has gone on, and as this privileged positions that we found ourselves in, a lot of people forget about that. They don't take enough stock of that sense of fortune and being fortunate. Ortega, who we mentioned in our last lecture, he is strongly of the view that this is a very important thing to confront, because if not, we lose a sense of value for what we actually have. And he talks about the fact that as civilization progressed, particularly into the Western post-industrial, technologically, the development of medicine and science and literature and writing and all of these things, he said every day added a new luxury. What before would have been considered one of fortune's gifts, inspiring humble gratitude towards destiny, was converted into a right, not to be grateful for, but to be insisted on. For in fact, the common person finds themselves in a world so excellent technically and socially, believes that it has been produced by nature, and never thinks of the personal efforts of highly evolved individuals which the creation of this new world presupposed. So Ortega is calling on us to have some kind of respect and gratitude for those who've gone before us, that have actually worked so hard and diligently and so often sacrificed themselves to create the kind of world that we now almost assume is our right. Why is this important? It's important because it takes us to the next piece, that the notion of selfhood and the notion of pursuing our own individuality is a gift that has taken millennia to bring us to. And so to have a respect for that and to understand that as an important part of our thinking, back to our thinking, gives us a foundation to face into our lives with a sense of gratitude for what we actually have. The person is no longer simply a cog in a machine or a leaf, like a leaf on a tree. And this has changed the world insofar as the focus of education, the focus of social welfare, the social of politics, the focus of all of these facilities are there because fundamentally we've actually grown to believe that the human being is important. And not only that, but we actually react strongly against systems that actually treat the individual human being as having dignity. We continue to move towards strengthening that value, the value on the person. Some people call this humanism, but that fundamental value can be argued that this fundamental value on the importance of the individual is in fact strongly influenced by Judeo-Christian morality, because the individual is actually being seen as a child of God. So their importance and dignity is being gifted to them by the Almighty. Now, we don't need to have that view, but that's important to put it in there in terms of the development of philosophy. That actually as civilization progresses, as our world progresses, and as these new gifts that are given, that Ortega talks about, these new amazing things that are happening, that all of those things communicate to us that you and I, who find ourselves now in the world, are important. The sociologist Weintraub, he summarizes this and he says, in our age, more than any other, we are captivated by an uncanny sense that each of us constitutes an irreplaceable human form, And we perceive a noble life task in the cultivation of our individuality, our ineffable self. So here we have Weintraub telling us that this first piece, which is that we constitute this irreplaceable human form, and from that as a foundation, we have a noble life task, which is to cultivate that individuality ourselves. Psychologist Abraham Maslow articulated this when he coined the phrase self-actualization. So all of those millennia of changes, all of that progress brings us to where we are today, which is that we have a noble life task to cultivate our ineffable self. And Maslow calls this self-actualization, actualizing the self, that unique human being that Frank talks about. So let's look at that a bit more closely and think, how do you go about that? Well, the first thing we need to look at is this distinction between essence and existence. This brings us really to something you may be familiar with, which is the debate, the nature-nurture debate. Because if we think about a person having an essence, what does that mean? And if we think about essence preceding existence, which is the opposite to what Jean-Paul Sartre says, which is that existence precedes essence, we're left in a position to ask ourselves the question, what do we come into the world with? Remember, we think about Plato and the cave when we think about the prisoners. And Plato's assumption is that all of the experiences, all of the reality that the prisoner is experiencing is the production of the people who are in control. The influences that are brought to bear on the individual. What Plato didn't know much about at that time was genetics. And one of the things that actually strikes me about a lot of thinking in the modern world is there's a push against the idea that our genetic inheritance plays a substantial part in who we become. That when we think about having a unique essence, there's a kind of resistance to the idea that that unique essence may in fact be largely as a result of the pre-programmed aspects of our personhood, which comes through our genetic inheritance. So we go back to the issue that I spoke earlier about trigger warning. Some of the things I'm going to say here may bother some people because they may not want to believe it. And it's interesting because I wonder sometimes why this is so. And I think part of it has to do with the idea that if you say that people are born with different abilities, different potentials, then in some kind of a way you're actually creating an imbalance, or you're creating some kind of an unfairness. And this is so true. Philosopher John Rawls, whose famous work on justice, 20th century philosopher, political philosopher, he coined this term, the natural lottery, which I think is a very useful one, if you think about the natural lottery. And what he's saying essentially is that it's a bit like a lottery because life is unfair and life can be cruel. And so there's a basic unfairness in the way that nature produces people. As the babies are born, and we look at the things that, some people start off in life with greater levels of health, greater levels of sort of different abilities. We're going to go into a little bit more closely on that. So his view on justice was that even though life is unfair, and even though there's an unfairness in the way that certain things are distributed among human beings, that our job or our task in creating a just society is to provide facilities whereby people who have started off in life with less going for them at a whole lot of different levels can be helped and assisted to reach the best that they can reach. So let's take something very simple but provocative example. Let's say take something like beauty. In every culture, there is some form that is acknowledged as being beautiful. There's the old phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And that's true in part. Because society doesn't believe that beauty is simply in the eye of the beholder. In societies, you have certain forms that are considered beautiful and attractive. And these forms and these are structural forms of the way the body is shaped. Height, width, a whole lot of different aspects, eyes, eye color, whatever. The fundamental piece is usually symmetry. Because even when you look to different structural aspects of what is called beautiful, one of the things that they notice is that it's that symmetry, which is how both sides of the body reflect each other, and if they reflect each other, the closer they get to perfection in terms of being with each other, that's very attractive. And that's because that type of symmetry is recognized by the human brain as representing health. So that's unfair, isn't it? Why is it, when you think about it, that some people arrive into the world and they have these forms that fit that picture? And it's doubly unfair because there's something else that goes on, which is called attribution error. Now, attribution error is a psychological system whereby human beings attribute certain characters to other human beings. And one of the things that happens if you fit the picture of the attraction picture, the attractiveness or the beauty picture, people would attribute other things to you. They will think that you're friendlier, or that you're more successful, or that you're more intelligent. So you start off with life, and if you have been blessed by nature, you will have an easier passage largely. And these are general principles. But it's an important part of looking at who you are to give that some consideration. If, on the other hand, you have arrived into life and nature has not been good to you on that in that way, then you may find that you're struggling, and that you may have to struggle through adversities that other people don't have to do. So your early experiences of how these happen in your formative years is going to affect who you've become along the way when you find yourself at what I call the Heideggerian point between the past and the future. You look back and you think, how have these experiences, how has that genetic inheritance created circumstances that have affected you? Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because there's an ideology out there that kind of refuses to accept this, and that ideology I think leads to a lot of heartache. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about 3 or 4 different fundamental things whereby life, the natural lottery happens in terms of what you've arrived into the world with. There are 4 areas where your genetic inheritance are significant to who you are in the world. The first and most obvious one, of course, is your biological sex. This has created an enormous firestorm in the online world because of the arguments around transgender activism and identification of sex, and Judith Butler's idea that we're assigned our sex. Sex is a social construct. Now, Judith Butler herself knows that biological sex is not a social construct. The idea of how we should define what being female and being male in our roles in the world, that's a slightly different thing. But the actual biological foundation of gender, the biological foundation of what we call gender, is given to us by our chromosomes, our genetic inheritance. So the XX chromosome and the XY. And if you've got an XY chromosome, when the fetus is in utero, about month 3 or 4, if there's an XY chromosome programmed, if that's the genetic program that's in the cellular structure, if it's an XY chromosome, then at about month 3 or month 4, there's a massive explosion of and release of testosterone, the hormone testosterone. And that testosterone, when that washes through the system, it's changed, the biological structures all begin to change. And the baby is born as a male. And if that XY chromosome isn't there, if it's an XX chromosome, then these changes don't happen, and the baby that's born is a female. Of course, that's an extraordinarily important piece of information about how our world works, because once a child arrives into this world, if our society privileges certain boys over girls or girls over boys, then their whole experience from then on is going to be affected by the fact that they have this genetic inheritance. That's the most obvious one. The other one is, of course, is our physical appearance. Look at this. Look at what it means to have the different physical experience. You think, for example, in the game of life, in the attraction to each other, sexual attraction. In the Western world, in general, women are more attracted to taller men. That is just a reality. What does this mean? This means that if you're biological, if the natural lottery has given you height, then you actually have, you're going to have more success as being an attractive person for a female. If you look at something like waist-hip ratio, which is another physical cue for women, so height is a physical cue for women to men, and waist-hip ratio is a physical cue from males to females. Now, I know that people rail against this. They don't like this because, I mean, most of us want to have a fair world, and it's difficult to actually acknowledge this is the way it is. And of course, we can try to do. The beauty industry works extremely hard, produces billions of euros spent every year trying to rectify some of these things so that you can create the forms that you need in order to feel that you're beautiful. Not necessarily that you're going to do that just to be sexually attractive or attractive to men, but because that's the model of beauty, and who doesn't want to feel that? Height is a different thing. It's harder to do anything with this, and I remember my own experience of this in the realization, because as a teenager, I was in a boarding school, and I remember, because I was short in stature, and you hit a growth spurt really around 13 or 14. Well, I didn't really hit much. When I did hit it, it came late, and it didn't last very long. So I grew up. I can remember the tormented feeling at that time in a boarding school full of other young lads who were all seemed so much taller than me, and I just, was wondering what I could do. There was nothing I could do. But that's a genetic inheritance. That affected me. Of course it affected me. I had to compensate in some ways for the fact that when they went out playing rugby, and I had to go out and play rugby, and, I was also short-sighted, which is also genetically endowed, unfortunately. So they didn't have contact lenses back then. So you either couldn't see what you were doing, if you left your glasses on, you could, So I spent most of my time, it was a little bit like something out of the Serengeti. I actually spent most of my time trying to pretend that I was interested in getting the rugby ball, knowing that my life was going to be in danger if I did catch it. So I learned certain psychological tricks by actually doing that. There's an example. So the reason why this is important is that when we think about who we want to become, how we want to design our lives, what does it mean to actually actualize ourselves, we have to take into account what have we got, what are the attributes that we have. So our physical attributes, being male, being female, our physical structure, height, eye color, hair color, bone structure, bone density, a whole lot of these things are given to us. And some people are very privileged in the way they have them, but they didn't work for that. And this is sometimes the unfairness of it. A lot of things go right for some people for no good reason, except they just got it by their birth. The other really controversial idea here as well is the idea of intelligence, general intelligence. Again, I think one of the reasons why people really cannot accept this, that there are genetic and inherited aspects of your intelligence that are given to you, that such a faculty could be so unfairly distributed in the human family. And so there's the people rail against this. But this is, when you look at what your life is about and how you want to develop your life, then of course, and we spoke in the first session about, or in the last session about educating yourself, self-education. For some people, that's easier than others. Essentially, intelligence really has to do with the prowess of your mind, that your mind works faster. For some people, their minds work faster. They solve problems seemingly more easily. It doesn't take as long or whatever. And every school teacher I've ever met will say that in every classroom, there's a couple of kids that are just so smart. And then there's a big bunch that are just smart and they're just fine, they're doing okay. And then there's a bunch of smaller group again that are what used to be called slow. And the reason why it's called slow is because it just took longer for them to get things. It took them longer to get things at every level. They struggled intellectually. And one of the reasons why people don't like the idea that, and the unfair piece, is that intelligence is distributed unfairly to different people, is the idea that sometimes people equate intelligence with goodness or with wisdom, and it isn't. That is not true. So you don't need to make that conflation. One of the most evil organizations in the 20th century was the SS. And they were more highly populated with intelligent, with graduates, with well-educated, with higher intelligent people than the mass, the ordinary Wehrmacht, the ordinary soldiers. Why is it important to say that? Well, because when we think about intelligence, if we conflate it with goodness, we're making a terrible mistake. At the moment, the Ukrainian war is on at the moment, and I'm looking at short films of, the cruise missiles coming in and destroying the infrastructure. And you look and you think, who made the cruise missiles? Well, you go back to your class, your high school or whatever, and you can be guaranteed. And then not only that and the incredible buildings that they're bombing, they're destroying. Who built those? Who designed them? What was the architecture? How did the engineers do that? When you go back to your high school or in your memory of your high school and you look, it's more than likely that the 4 or 5 kids in your class who are actually really sort of seem to be smart and seem to get everything, they're the kind of people that go out to make these things. And so what we know about intelligence is that if you're going to do something bad and you're intelligent, you'll do it very well. And that's the truth of when you look back at all the different aspects of the genocides and the Holocaust and everything, the people who arranged all of this stuff, often very intelligent people, to make the arrangements, get the structure going, and then they use people who are less intelligent as the foot soldiers. And this is true both in terms of the positive and the negative. So the most amazing things that have been created in this world, which we enjoy all of the time. We're having a conversation here, and there's a camera in front of me. How did that happen? How could it be that we can create these amazing tools to communicate? It's the people who are highly intelligent do that. So intelligence is not good or bad. It's a tool. It's the way your mind works. And some people's minds work better than others. That's that simple. And some of that, proportion of it, is genetically coded. Perhaps the best example of this, proof of this, is Robert McNamara, who's the defense secretary under the Kennedy administration at the time of the Vietnam War. McNamara had great faith in the value of education and training, and he held the false belief that you can teach people to become more intelligent. Or even at least to overcome the cognitive deficits that go with low intelligence. And entry into the military at that point, you took an IQ test, and if you scored less than 85, you would not be allowed to become a soldier, basically. But they were short of soldiers because the middle classes at the time were resisting the draft hugely, and nobody wanted to send their lovely college kids off to war. So they needed more soldiers. So both the poor and the less intelligent were targeted as for recruits. Well, the poor were the recruits from the very beginning anyway. They didn't have some kind of way to get out. They couldn't get out of the draft. So they drafted 100,000 low IQ young men into the army. And Gregory Campbell's account in his book McNamara's Folly, the use of low IQ troops in Vietnam, is a harrowing and moving account that underpins what happened. No matter how much training they gave these people, they gave them training, mentorship, and all the rest of that. they were killed and maimed in far greater numbers, far greater proportion than the ordinary soldiers. And they also led to the death of other soldiers who were more competent soldiers, because, of course, in war, you try to protect your buddy. So people would try to protect these kids as they went out, and they weren't able to function very well, and they got killed and injured trying to save their friends. So that's a very practical example of the refusal to accept that intelligence exists, it's important, and you have your share of it. And so your expectations and how you want to do and what you want to do with that, that's an important part of your noble task to become the best person you can become. Another aspect of yourself which is strongly influenced by your genetics is your temperament. Now, anybody who has had the experience of raising children from infancy will tell you that there are noticeable differences between them from the very beginning of life. And because it's from the very beginning of life, they haven't been trained into any of this. This is just how they are in the world. Some babies are very smiley and responsive and curious and eager to engage and eager to give feedback. Others are quieter, serene, and placid. And then others are cranky, easily upset, easily frightened. They kind of have a startle reflex, a faster startle reflex. And I just think about, the parents that actually have to take care of the different children. I mean, some are more taxing